This podcast is sponsored by A. Miller George Funeral Home, where each life is celebrated, and their sister company, Cremation London and Middlesex, both family-owned and operated. By Hyde Park Care Pharmacy. Experience the difference an independent pharmacy can make for you and your loved ones. Hyde Park Care Pharmacy offers personalized care, short wait time, very competitive pricing, easy transfer of your prescription, and much more. And by Molly Maid. During these times of COVID-19, it has never been more important to keep your family safe. With the Healthy Home Cleaning System, Molly Maid London is here to help. Make your home a healthy haven. Call Molly Maid London today. Today, we welcome the Reverend Dr. Danielle Tumminio Hansen. Dr. Tumminio Hansen joined the Candler School of Theology in 2021. Prior to arriving at Candler, she was assistant professor of pastoral theology and served as director of field education at Seminary of the Southwest in Austin, Texas, where she taught courses on trauma, practical theology, and pastoral theology with a feminist, intersectional, and anti-racist lens. She is the author of several works in practical theology, namely Conceiving Family, a practical theology of surrogacy and self, as well as God and Harry Potter at Yale.
Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, whenever and wherever you may be. Welcome back to another edition of the Vicar's Crossing podcast. The Vicar's Crossing is a virtual space where faith intersects with the public square. And we are back for episode 2 of our 6th season on the Vicar's Crossing. And I'm Rob Henderson from Holy Trinity St. Stephen's in London, Ontario.
Kevin George here from St. Aidan's Church over in the northwest corner.
My name is Ian. I'm a content creator, producer, and the person who sends this out into the world. How are you doing?
He's the man, the myth, the legend. We missed you last week, buddy.
You're back.
I'm back.
What were you doing?
Awesome.
I was moving my great-grandmother into her new apartment.
Now tell the world, how old is your great-grandmother?
She is 100.
Get out.
Yeah.
And her name is?
Doreen.
Doreen.
Oh,
Big shout out to Doreen. Hey?
Yeah.
100
Good
years
for
old.
you. 100 years old. Awesome.
It was also like the same day where it was minus 20 with the wind chill feeling like minus ridiculous. So it was great.
Awesome.
Is she loving the new digs? Is she happy?
Her new place is really, really nice. I have to admit, it's a really nice place. Yeah.
Awesome.
Good. All right, Grandma Ian, sounds like you might be moving in with you. You kind of like it.
That's good stuff.
That's good stuff. All right, guys. Well, as I say, season 6 freshly underway. We're into our 2nd episode here, and today we're excited to welcome scholar, public theologian, author, priest, and professor, Dr. Danielle Tumminio Hansen. And Dr. Hansen is going to be here in a little bit to discuss her book, which is called Conceiving Family, a Practical Theology of Surrogacy and Self, and her work with literature and the practice of ministry and the theological implications of trauma. These are all things that she works on and writes about. So we'll talk to her coming up.
Yeah, very excited. Professor Tumminio Hansen has done some really incredibly wonderful scholarly work, and it's going to be fun to talk to her. So, but before we do, we want to do our land acknowledgement and acknowledge the land on which we record this podcast, or the traditional lands of the Anishinaabe, Haudenosaunee, Lenape, and Adirondack peoples, on the lands connected with the London Township and Sombre Treaties of 1796 and the Dish with One Spoon Covenant Wampum. These lands continue to be home to diverse Indigenous peoples whom we recognize as contemporary stewards of the land and vital contributors to our society, and people with whom we wish to work to continue to move towards total restoration and reconciliation.
Mm-hmm. And a thank you and hello to our wonderful sponsors here on the Vicar's Crossing. We couldn't do it without you guys. To A. Miller George Funeral Home, where each life is celebrated, and their sister company, Cremation London and Middlesex, both family owned and operated. Our thanks, as always, to Dave Mullen and his fine staff at A. Miller George.
And we want to give a shout out to Carol Basato over at Hyde Park Care Pharmacy. Hyde Park Care Pharmacy, locally owned, locally operated, locally loved Can't get a better place. Get your flu shot, get your vaccine, get your boost, get whatever you need over there. You get all jacked up, man. It's good to have a druggie as a sponsor on the podcast. I got everything I need. One-stop shopping.
You're all set.
And last but certainly not least, we want to say a big special thank you to Molly Maid. Make your home a healthy haven. Call Molly Maid London today. And Trisha Lister was a wonderful human being who hooked us up with that. So thank you to them over there.
Cool. Hey guys, I got to tell you something. It's getting pretty exciting in the Henderson house.
Okay.
Oh, really?
I don't know if you guys do this, but on the Tim Hortons app, there's a hockey pool thing that you can get into, and so every night you choose who you think's going to score goals.
Yep.
And if you get 7 days in a row where you pick somebody that scored a goal, by the seventh day, you get a whole week's full of coffee.
Come on.
Whoa.
Get free coffee for a week at Tim Hortons. So tonight, guys, is night 7 for me.
Who have you picked?
So I'm going to kill myself for doing this. I've put all my hopes in the Toronto Maple Leafs.
Oh Lord.
So I picked 3 different Leafs. If any one of them scored tonight, then I get coffee.
Okay, so I'm going to say you pick Marner.
Nope.
Oh, Matthews.
Oh.
Yeah, Matthews is one.
Tavares.
No.
Riley.
No. Yes.
Okay.
And the third one is Spezza.
Okay. The pizza man.
So so if any of those score tonight,
okay.
I can't believe I'm putting my hopes on the Leafs.
Yeah.
But we'll let you know how it all turns out.
All right.
Next time.
Wow.
Good stuff.
Wow.
Now, Kevin, it's only episode 2 of our 6th season. We got lots more to come. So why don't we play our little segment right now, which we like to call, Kevin, who in the world did you book this week?
Well, I'm ever glad you asked. Drum roll, please. Well, with that great drum roll, it is great for me to tell you about how I booked Tony and Susie Troxler. Here they are. If you're on YouTube, you get to see this. So we'll talk. It's interesting because today we're talking about surrogacy, but Susie and Tony gave birth just last fall. She was 50 when she gave birth to a beautiful little baby girl, and it was her first child. And so at ages 61 and 50, and she is a very faithful person, and she took great heart in a story of Sarah in the Bible, and she felt that was going to happen for her, and so she delivered her first child at age 50.
Good for her. Congratulations.
I guess there's hope for me and Catherine Ann yet.
Yes, of course there is. Of course there is. That's right.
Let's just pray that that's not going to happen, but it could happen. What Susie and Tony are teaching me is it could happen.
Well, if you guys do, then my gift is free Tim Hortons for a week. I'm going to make sure you're all set. Okay, that's good. Well, good. We'll look forward to seeing them. And we're looking forward to our guest for today. Of course, Dr. Danielle Tumminio Hansen is here, and we're going to bring her into our Zoom room and talk to her today on the Vicar's Crossing.
Awesome.
And here is Danielle into the Vicar's Crossing podcast and into our Zoom room today. Danielle, so great to have you here. We're so excited that you could spend some time with us to talk about your book and some other things. So welcome to the Vicar's Crossing.
Thank you so much for having me. I appreciate it.
What part of the world are you coming to us from?
I am coming to you from Austin, Texas, although I work in Atlanta, Georgia. So I am coming to you from the virtual world in many places.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Well, we were just saying prayers for folks in Texas with that mess at synagogue, and our local rabbi actually is a good friend to the rabbi there, and there was a lot of concern for everybody. And I'm guessing it's probably a little bit warmer there than it is here today, but I could be wrong. You guys got a cold snap, didn't you?
We're getting it tonight. I saw that the temperature was going to drop overnight, and I expect that the schools will be closed tomorrow, but you'll probably get a kick out of this. They close the schools with, just the barest little dusting of snow, the kind of snow that that like sticks to the roof of a house, but not really to the cement that you drive on.
That's right.
Just up the road here, 2 hours, Toronto just had like 1.5 feet in one day. So it was nuts. We didn't get it so bad here. But, nowadays, since COVID and online learning, I think snow days are a thing of the past in Canada. So now,
they don't even have
So
that's a terrible casualty.
I know. Well, what are you going to do? Well, look, we're so glad that you made time for us. I came upon your work about a half a year ago and was really so incredibly impressed with everything you're doing. And the book, Conceiving Family, which we'll talk about in a bit, is just so well done, and delves into all the complexities of what's involved with this business, if I can say that, of surrogacy, and that there's all kinds of life-giving parts of that and all kinds of parts of that that are fraught with challenge as well. And I just really love the way you handled all that. I also happened upon an article that you wrote in the July issue of Modern Theology titled "Remembering Rape in Heaven: Constructive Proposal for Memory and Eschatological Self." In it, you address the question, will there be monuments to Hiroshima in the world to come? And that is the question that drives the inquiry of Miroslav Volf's The End of Memory, in which he argues that the teleos of memory is the forgetting of it, that memories must be erased to make room for the all-encompassing love of God. You push back against that by writing about trauma, and specifically about sexual trauma, recounting your own lived experience of assault and rape. It's an incredibly well-written and honest piece, and an important pushback against an eschatological vision in which our current life, with its joys and traumas and growing edges, is forgotten. You write in the article, in proposing that humans are called to forget, such theologies not only espouse an eschatological vision for the future, but also allude to ways of being pre-mortem that are theologically problematic when viewed through the lens of sexual trauma, and that have the potential to cause damage not only to individual survivors of sexual trauma, but also to the church and to secular culture at large. You're really elevating in this piece a theology that affirms that God both recognizes the depth and the harm we experience and accounts for it, and is not at all sort of discounting that. You write about the freedom that comes from this honest assessment of a broken world as epistemic liberation from false ideologies. And I really like this piece because a lot of people want to forget that which is painful, but you speak about it in liberative terms. And I'll just quote this little piece before I get your reaction. You say, it's not a joyous freedom to recognize that the world is far more oppressive for women than I once believed, but it is freedom nonetheless. It is the freedom to rage and grieve, the freedom to identify the source of the problem and see the contours of it, freedom to claim the role that epistemic and hermeneutical injustice play in such traumas. It is the freedom that emerges with the resolution of cognitive dissonance, the freedom that comes from having the veil lifted, that emerges with the resolution, the veil lifted from one's eyes, so that one can no longer turn away from the injustice and violence and power differentials that are so ingrained in humanity and that have become a form of original sin, transmitted from generation to generation. It is the freedom to understand, to name, and eventually to act in resistance. Can you say more about that liberation in working through the interpretation of sexual trauma, and why assuring survivors of sexual trauma that they need not accept a God that requires them to forget themselves is so critically important?
Yeah, thank you for that question. And thank you for such a careful reading of that piece. It was a really important piece for me to write, and I'm grateful to have the chance to talk about it. So many people who encounter something like what I experienced, or or other kinds of trauma, find themselves reassessing their assumptions about the world. And part of that, especially in cases of sexual trauma, is reassessing your own sense of safety and how safe you are in the world around you. So one of the things that's really common among survivors of sexual trauma especially, but certainly of other kinds of traumas, is the tendency to blame themselves. And what psychologists have found is that people tend to blame themselves, at least in part, because it gives them an explanation, somewhere concrete to go for why this bad thing happened. And even though blame is kind of it's a yucky feeling, there's something that becomes reliable about being able to have an answer. And so psychologists feel like it's easier, it can initially at least feel easier to live in a world where you can point to yourself and say, oh, I did something wrong, than to admit that the harm that you experienced is random or the result of systemic oppression. In other words, it's out of your control. It's a lot easier to blame yourself because that's something that might be in your control. So there comes a point where these coping mechanisms just don't work anymore. And you kind of have to have a reckoning of, gosh, the world isn't as safe as I thought it was, or the way people project onto my identity as a woman has consequences that are beyond my control, or, oh gosh, this self-blame thing isn't going to work because it's not actually the cause of the problem. When you start doing that reassessment, you come to realize that you're living in a totally different world than you thought you were living in. And your place in it winds up looking different as well. So here's another kind of question that people ask that might change how they see the world in the aftermath of trauma. So as a pastoral care professor, one of the things that I see written about a lot is the problem of evil, and people saying, why me? Why did this bad thing happen to me? That's actually not a question I ever asked. I asked, why not me? There didn't seem to be anything very interesting about me. But certainly many people do ask this question. And when you start to ask that question, some people begin to realize that there wasn't a particular reason why it was them, but to point to yourself and say, maybe I did do something wrong that led to this, shifts. I'm sorry, let me say that again. When you ask that question of why me, you start to see that the idea that people can be punished for a wrongdoing is not always, and often not, the reason that the bad thing occurred. And so you start to, again, begin to see, oh gosh, maybe I was just in the wrong place at the wrong time. Maybe these things are happening because my identity is being socially constructed in a certain way. All of those things, it turns out, make you vulnerable to harm, again, in ways that are beyond your control. So, philosophically or theologically, you might call this kind of an epistemic transformation, which is just a fancy way of saying a shift in how you understand the world or how you know the world. And that means you come to see the world differently. And that might not be something that a person thinks of as liberating or freeing, but I certainly do, because if you see the world differently, and in fact, more honestly, it allows you to understand this creation in some ways for what it is right now, and to hold on to a hope of a future that's different, and then to act in the world to try to make that future a reality. Your second question about whether, why it's important that God remembers our traumas or doesn't forget the harms we experience. So I saw a few survivors react to my article who said, my own experience of sexual trauma has taken up enough grief, enough airtime in my brain. It's been upsetting enough in this life. I do not want to remember it in the life to come. That is not what I want. And, and perhaps God will honor that wish. I think a desire to forget that comes of your own agency could very well serve a very different purpose. And it's, to some extent, not something I was thinking quite so much about as I was writing. But for me, what I think is that, and I think many survivors would say this, I'm not the person I would have been had this not occurred. I see the world very differently. I act in the world very differently. And so to take away that memory would be to take away the person, not the power that, say, a perpetrator has, but rather the person that I've become. And that didn't make a lot of sense. But even my own experience aside, or the experience of survivors aside, I think there are two important theological reasons why forgetting traumas is problematic. And the first is it affects who God is. If we forget the bad things that happen to us here, then we have to ask the question, why did God expose them to us if God isn't going to do anything to kind of make things right besides just making us forget them? It kind of makes God into this tyrant who makes us suffer on earth only then to just forget about it instead of doing something to make it right. And the second, I think, really compelling reason is we have to contend with Jesus on the cross. And even if, for many Christians, that suffering has salvific value, but we're not called to forget it. We're called to remember it. And if we're made in the image of God, shouldn't we be called to remember, human suffering as well? Or does this mean we're supposed to forget about Jesus on the cross? Like, is Jesus in heaven having forgotten about his time on the cross? That doesn't make a lot of sense to me.
No, that's the rich tradition of the liturgy every year, right? Because we have Good Friday. We all gather together and we look at it. So
and on a regular weekly basis, it's anamnesis, right? Like it's this, it's a shared generational memory. And I really was impressed by that article and its depth, because I really do believe that in our modern culture, there's a propensity or a tendency to want to wipe away any suffering, to wash out any of that stuff. And I think that when you write about interpretation in that article, and when you write about interpreting your own experience and speak about who you've become, or other survivors of sexual trauma, or as you say, other trauma in general, then that becomes such a critical part of who we are. And to sort of have to, even a broad question, as Wolf starts with, will there be a monument to Hiroshima? Like, we should never forget Hiroshima, right? Like that, to sort of just say, well, we want to get past all that. Well, we're not. And whether it's Black Lives Matter or all the racial stuff we're facing, on it goes. Anyway, to shove ahead, you partway through this never-ending pandemic, this gift that keeps on giving, you had an incredible, another great article, this one in Christian Century, and it too was about trauma, but in a more general sense, a more accessible place for folks to get. Specifically, the article was about the ways faith leaders can shift to trauma-informed ministry. You wrote it in September of 2020. Which seems like a hell of a long time ago. I just got to say. It sure does. And you pointed out in there that we live in, and this is what you said in 2020, we live in an environment of widespread individual and collective trauma. The pandemic wears on, you said, in 2020, causing heightened anxiety about who is safe, where is safe, and which air is safe to breathe. High unemployment, economic worries continue, and so on. You go on to write about the murder of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, the demonstrations we've seen. But since then, since you wrote this, there's been an American election, an attempted insurrection. Here in our city, here in London, a city of 500,000 people, we had a terror attack that took out 3 generations of a family and left a 7-year-old boy without his sister, his mom, his dad, and his grandma. That caused marches in the city. We've also had a terrible, just a car crash recently where 7 Girl Guides brownies were run over. It just feels like, at least here in town, we're exhausted from it all. We feel trauma after trauma after trauma. Now we're in the 5th wave of the pandemic. And here in Canada, that's meant a lot. I watched my Montreal Canadiens play the Dallas Stars last night, and the arena was packed, but they're not allowed to play in Quebec right now, right? So, and so because we just won't expose people, and so it's just a very different thing going on in terms of the different countries. But just reading all of this to you is exhausting, and so I feel like we're all carrying a lot of trauma. How do we as faith leaders make that pivot that you're talking about, which is a word now we all say a lot, pivot? How do we pivot to this trauma-informed ministry? And how do we handle the trauma which we as faith leaders ourselves lugging about, right? Like, I mean, we want to be attentive to other people's trauma, but what, how do we do all that?
Yeah, so I think one thing that's really unique about this particular kind of trauma is that other kinds of traumas, it feels like even if you can't point to it specifically, there is a place where the trauma ends, right? So, if it's an individual or a community that's been affected by trauma, the trauma can certainly radiate out. It can radiate out to other individuals in the community who, say, weren't at the site of the trauma or were don't know the people involved. Those people can be traumatized too, but it feels like at some point you get outside of the sphere of that trauma. And the same in time. Let's say a community experiences a trauma. Maybe it's 3 years, maybe it's 10 years, maybe it's 100 years down the line, that community moves beyond the trauma. I think the difference right now for us is that it doesn't feel like there is a space for humans where they can be outside of the influence of this trauma. So even if you don't know someone who, say, died from COVID, you're being affected at a secondary level or a tertiary level by COVID, and certainly not enough time has passed for us to move beyond the trauma of the pandemic, because we're still in the pandemic. So those spaces don't exist for us. So, I think the global reality of this pandemic is part of what sets this trauma into a really unique category that affects faith leaders in a very unique way, because they might have ministered before to traumatized individuals while they themselves were not traumatized. But when it comes to the pandemic, to some extent, they're being affected by the trauma as well, whether it's because a lot of people in their congregations have gotten sick and died, whether, they may have gotten sick and gotten long COVID, they're just plain burnt out, they're exhausted, the pivoting is too much, maybe there are financial problems for the congregation. All of those create stress and anxiety, and it feels like there's nowhere to go to get away from it, especially if you're kind of stuck in your house. So I think that there are a few things that can help. There are the time-honored things that we've always talked about with faith leaders in terms of making sure you have really good support, that you have really good colleagues that you can talk to, that you have a therapist if you need a therapist. But there are some specific things I pointed to in this article that I think can be useful also. And one of them is understanding how the science of trauma affects the brain, because it can help faith leaders understand what they're seeing. So if you are noticing that, say, some volunteers in your congregation keep forgetting to do things, it might not be that they have some kind of ill will or they're angry. Trauma causes brain fog. It makes people really forgetful. And so understanding that can help you know their reactions. I think the two reactions I find most useful to know about are hypervigilance and numbing. And we know that traumatized individuals experience this thing, it's called a dialectic, because a dialectic is something that shifts back and forth between numbing symptoms like forgetting, trying to avoid the trauma, and symptoms of hypervigilance where you're hyper aware. So very early in the pandemic, probably in like week 3 of the pandemic, I came across...
You can call it a trauma. I have no problem.
Right, yeah. Thank you. Freudian, not so Freudian slip. I came across this book called The Psychology of Pandemics. I recommend it to anyone I come across that we're talking about this with. And it was published in 2019, before this current pandemic. But one of the things the author talks a lot about is how you see hypervigilance and numbing reactions in prior pandemics. And so these might look like someone who's hypervigilant might take their temperature all the time, once a day, even though they haven't left the house. But they might also be the first person to order a new set of masks online. There are the people who had the toilet paper at Costco. Like I was at Costco 3 weeks before the pandemic started. I see all these people with toilet paper, and I'm going, why are all these people buying toilet paper? And why are they buying hand sanitizer? Like, what's this about? So they were a little more hyper vigilant than I was.
went for beer. I just had
there you go.
My priority was beer. I figured there are many ways that I can clean my rear end, but if I'm out of beer, there's a problem.
So you see, so there's you can have those reactions where people are, really, really paying a lot of attention to the pandemic, and you're trying to be hyper aware of it. Now, in moderation, those reactions are okay. They keep you safe. If they become extreme and take over your life, then that's a sign that you need some help. On the other side, you see numbing reactions, people trying to forget the trauma. So what are some examples of that? We see that too. So that can range from people, just kind of saying, I've got to live my life a little more than just being in the house. And so I'm going to, go for a walk and think about something else in the great outdoors. That's sort of a healthy way of separating oneself out from the trauma, trying to forget about it a little. But again, these numbing reactions can be problematic as well. So we've heard about people who are kind of super spreaders, or people who, are going to giant parties and close spaces with no masks on, perhaps believing COVID doesn't exist. I had someone who came to tune our piano who told me COVID didn't exist. And I thought, that it's a very interesting numbing reaction. So, so I think, again, understanding those as a minister can be really helpful, because it allows you to say, okay, now I have a box to put what I'm seeing in so that it makes sense. These behaviors that might seem sort of strange are actually very predictable ways of coping with the trauma. Are they healthy? Not necessarily, but they are pretty predictable ways that people cope with traumas. And, traumas are events that are outside of the realm of what we associate with daily life or can expect in daily life. And so it's the brain trying to come up with ways to make sense of things that don't make sense.
Right. Yeah.
So understanding the science of trauma can be really helpful.
And yeah, for certainly those that are in pastoral situations and in parishes and such, would you say too that it's also important to not self-diagnose per se, but to have that awareness of where you are on that scale too before you go and try to understand what other people are going to go through too? I imagine both are important.
Absolutely. I think that self-awareness is really important for your own wellness as a human being, if you're in ministry as a minister. And the other thing I talk about in that article that I think is incredibly important, Judith Herman, who is the one of the biggest names in trauma theory, talks about 3 stages of trauma recovery. The first is safety, the second is remembrance, and the third is reconnection. You can't do anything without safety. You can't have any kind of healing without safety. And safety is not just physical, it's emotional, it's psychological, and it's spiritual. So I think asking, where are the places of spiritual safety that are meaningful to me? Is it a prayer? Is it a practice? Is it a liturgy? Pulling on those can be really, really grounding during and after a trauma.
Yeah, good. Thank you. That's very helpful. Ian has a question about, well, we're going to go off another direction, I think.
Yeah, I think before we dive into your recent book, Conceiving Family, I want to pivot to your 2010 book called
You
God
and Your Pivots.
and Harry. I slipped that in just as a
in scripture the pivot is but now.
That's right.
But now, that's the pivot in Isaiah.
But I'm curious about the book you wrote called God and Harry Potter at Yale. That's an amazing title. You write in spoilers for people who haven't read it. You write near the end of the book that the Harry Potter books seem to have a kind of keep it real attitude that places an emphasis on how God can be discovered in the world. We see the same stress in how the books deal with the end of times. You write, and I'll just quote you here, a reign of peace may only be accomplished through the power of love, just as God's power enacts a new world from the Christian perspective. but it can only come about when humans agree to help. Only then can love work through others and bring about a more peaceful, accepting global community. For members of Harry's world, this means that the choices they make matter. Only when they commit to only when they commit to believe in love and then work on its behalf does love have the possibility of trumping evil. But the same might be said for our world as well. Until each person takes on the challenge of living with a generous and loving heart, there is no hope for a world without tears. This is the message I leave my students with at the close of term, that in the end, the hope for Harry's world is the same as a Christian hope for ours, but it will remain a hope until we live in a way that can make it a reality. Mm-hmm. And I find that connection between like Harry Potter and that magical world and the Bible and our current world, that's a very interesting connection. What was the motivation for that book? And can you say more about this importance of intersection and that sort of overlap with literature and the spiritual journey?
Yeah, so I wrote that book after teaching what I'm told is the first university level class on Christian theology and Harry Potter. And awesome. I wanted to teach that class because I'd been watching the conversation unfold about whether the books were heretical. And it was a very hot topic, especially prior to the publication of the last book. And there were segments of the Christian population who felt very strongly the book shouldn't be read, that they were supporting witchcraft, and they were encouraging children to be witches and wizards, and that this was heretical because the Bible tells you that you shouldn't be a witch or a wizard.
Just interrupt you for a second. I just have to tell you that I sat in my wife is Roman Catholic and works for the Roman Catholic Church. I sat in a mass where a priest in his sermon, just exactly what you said, and I left. I said, okay, I got to get out of here. I can't listen to this. Well, they're telling us not to. But anyway, I'm sorry I interrupted you, Danielle.
I'm also gonna jump in. Sorry, but they there was a group of like right Christian, the people who believe that they shouldn't be reading Harry Potter to kids. They rewrote all of Harry Potter as like a religious Jesus type book, and a lot of it doesn't make any sense. Yeah, basically.
Sorry for the interruption. I couldn't. I was listening to you and I'm thinking, oh, I had to walk out of a mass because of this very subject.
Well, it's funny you mentioned this because one of the things I would tell my students is that I imagine if you go to church, you hear many more sermons on things like salvation and evil than you would on witchcraft. But I guess I was wrong for that Roman Catholic Church. So, I think that to me, the thing that was interesting about it was that I thought, gosh, I just don't hear about witches and wizards in church all that often at all. But what I do hear about is sin, salvation, grace, evil, like these big topics in theology. And so I wanted to write the book and teach, I wanted to teach the class because I felt like what I was seeing were a bunch of 800-word punchy editorials, and they didn't have the space to dig into the richness of Christian thought. You need so much more time than that. And I thought, well, a semester is a great amount of time to do some real exploring. And so I proposed this class, and the class involved taking students through some of the major topics in Christian theology as they read the books, and then asking, is there salvation in the series? Is there anything like the problem of evil in the series? Is there grace in the series? And then, at the end, asking the students, so what do you think? Do these books align with Christian theology or not? And I wrote the book to kind of offer a resource for the kinds of topics I covered in the classroom, and to say, here's how Christians think about a whole bunch of topics you're not covering in these editorials that actually do line up with the books fairly well. I think there is unmerited grace that's offered, and there is something like salvation. There's certainly something like eschatology in the book of Revelation, which is what you're quoting from at the end, this, Revelation 21. that we might live in a world of no sorrow, sighing, and pain in the future. I think that's what the vision, spoiler alert, at the end kind of offers us. So, and certainly the end of book 7, there are so many parallels between the Christian story, trying not to give too many spoilers now. So that's kind of why I wrote it. And
awesome.
I do see many parallels still.
Before Rob moves on, I want to tell a quick story, because drawing a comparison to like Harry Potter is similar to the comparison that Kevin drew after he came with us to see the last Star Wars movie, or the 9th Star Wars movie. The first thing he said to us as we were exiting the theater was, "That's just like a Bible story." Yeah. So I
Powers of darkness and light.
Yeah, you can see it. Yeah, exactly.
So you consider all these new movies are part of the Star Wars canon, you think, or is that a different podcast episode?
I think that's a different podcast episode. Is that something you want to get into? But we could just change the podcast entirely if you want to talk about that.
If we ever get past COVID, the promise is I'm going to Ian's house and we're going to watch every Star Wars movie, because I've not watched them. The only one I've seen in the theater was the one I went and saw with Ian, and I've never watched the originals or any of that.
Oh boy!
So I need to start at the beginning and go through the whole thing. So
I would love. I'll remind me after this podcast is done. I would love to know your thoughts a little bit more about that.
In the theology of Star Wars.
No, on Danielle's thought about the Star Wars canon and lore and stuff.
Right.
Anyway,
we will do that. We will do that down the road. Now, Danielle, you also have another book which is out that we want to talk a little bit about today, for sure. It's Conceiving Family: A Practical Theology of Surrogacy and Self. So at the beginning of the book, you remind the reader that surrogacy in the process is a very arduous, very expensive process, as much as, I couldn't believe this number, $100,000 in the United States to do this. It's also painful, requires surgeries and daily shots. Yet surrogacy rates are on the rise despite all those difficulties, outpacing the rate of growth for other reproductive technologies in the US. Perhaps the most obvious question that follows then is, what compels someone to choose to participate in it in the first place, given not just the discomfort, but also the cost, right? So think about that. And you write about root and projected desires along with their connection to reproductive loss as a form of trauma. So can you say more about that connection between reproductive loss as trauma, and how it, as well as like social construction of the family and personal or cultural narratives regarding identity and agency, how that all plays a role, and why more people avail themselves of surrogacy right now?
So much to say. So in terms of why more people are using surrogacy now, or why it keeps gaining, why it's used faster than other, I'm going to start over. In terms of why surrogacy, I think, is turned to increasingly in the United States, it's a complicated question, but I think one of the primary reasons is that individuals feel that they've exhausted all their other options. So surrogacy is far and away the most expensive form of assisted reproduction. So individuals who use a surrogate have oftentimes tried IVF, they've tried egg donation, they've tried some other things that would be less expensive, and they haven't worked. There is the question of why those individuals don't turn to adoption, which would be cheaper than surrogacy as well. And, some individuals who use surrogates might have adoption processes ongoing. A lot of times people feel that adoption is going to be problematic for a couple of reasons. They might feel that they have no control over the timeline, that it might take too long. They may feel that they wouldn't love a child who's not biologically theirs. And I have a lot to say about that. And they might also feel that they might explicitly or implicitly feel that genetically they don't want to raise a child who's genetically not theirs, because they feel like their genes are really valuable. They want to see somebody who looks like them, and who they believe they share more in common with because they share genes. And I think probably of all of these sort of problematic ways of thinking about adoption, probably the most problematic is the idea that a child who, say, is adopted out of the foster system, in particular, is going to have issues that are so difficult to manage that the parent doesn't want to raise that child. And and that's problematic, at least as a Christian, because we respect the dignity of every human being. Now, in the defense of not wanting to adopt, I've heard some anti-adoption advocates, especially those who have been adopted, say that there's something called adoption trauma, that people feel that not having access to their adopted parents or not knowing their adopted parents or the process of being adopted in the first place can be traumatic. I think I haven't researched this a ton, but I think to me, it's a more compelling reason than any of the other reasons I just gave for not using adoption. So, but the point is, for whatever reason, individuals can't adopt a child or don't want to. So they turn to surrogacy. And, I think they feel that this might be the very last way that they may be able to have children at all. In the United States, it is very expensive. It is also much less regulated in the United States than in many other countries. There are a number of other countries where surrogacy is either illegal or it's only altruistic, so you don't pay the surrogate. In the United States, the surrogate is paid, somewhere between $20,000 and $60,000. It varies very widely, and I think parents feel like, again, this could be their last chance to have a child. They also feel like they might have more control over the process because they can contract with the surrogate to say not drink alcohol, have a healthy diet. They know that she's going to appointments. So there are all sorts of reasons that they turn to the surrogate.
Right.
You had so many more questions and now I'm forgetting what they are.
Oh, well, no, that was it. But
the other thing that sort of pops up out of there that I wonder about is just the social constructs, like the idea of family and what constitutes a family.
Yeah. So I write about something that I call the idol of the biological family. And I think that this probably is an idol that affects heterosexual couples more than anyone else.
Right.
So we have this assumption, or I think heterosexual couples especially have this assumption that reproduction can be a private enterprise, that you can just go into your bedroom and make a baby. And the problem with that is that it never is a private enterprise. Even if you can create an embryo via heterosexual sexual experience, you need a doctor to help you throughout the pregnancy. You need a doctor to help you birth a child. You need nurses. Once the child is here, you need people to help you raise the child. You need teachers. You need daycare workers. Yeah. So reproduction is never private. But I think heterosexual couples especially think it is. And so then when they can't have children in this insular way that's limited to the couple, they try to imitate reproduction in the closest way possible to having a biological family. So that might mean first turning to IVF, then turning to an egg or sperm donor, and then turning to a surrogate, because all of these could be the closest thing you could get to the biological family. I think for single individuals or gay couples who are turning to these technologies, they know at the start that they're not going to be able to have children the way a heterosexual couple would. And so they're coming to the procedures very differently in terms of their mindset. Now, are they exempt from reproductive trauma? No, because they could still have a miscarriage. They could still experience a stillbirth. There are certainly, they can still struggle with infertility. So they're not exempt from that part of forms of reproductive trauma. But I think that idol of the biological family is very, very powerful. And it kind of drives people, I think, towards surrogacy, especially maybe instead of adoption, in ways that are problematic only because you start to question, is this what a person would do if that idol wasn't there? Right. Is this what they're genuinely called to, or is the idol pushing their choice? And and that's a big question. Right. And that's, you mentioned my terms, root and projected desires. Yeah. You can have a root desire, which I see as kind of a genuine calling, yeah, or a projected desire, which is something that you genuinely feel that you want, but maybe you want it because society has constructed you to want in a certain way.
Yeah, exactly. Many surrogates see themselves as heroes, and in places like Canada, where surrogates cannot be paid beyond their expenses, the altruism is critical. And you write in the book, and a short quote for folks: most surrogates believe that biological children are a good worth having, in part because they are a good they already achieved, and in which they found value. Parenthood has been a meaningful experience for the surrogate, an experience she wants others to share. And agencies will emphasize that surrogates have a great power because intended parents could not achieve their dream of parenthood without them. And again, you write, the surrogate therefore functions as a woman with a mission or a calling to create biologically based parents, and is nothing short of a hero. And so, just to put a bit of a local spin on it here, this certainly bears true with Heather Gunn, who is a local Londoner where we live, and she's also a single mother of 3 and is a 3-time surrogate. And she says that she was drawn to surrogacy after her twin girls were born. She has had the intended parents in the room with her for each birth, and said of the experience, you just feel so proud. And I cried tears of joy. Someone gets to meet their baby in large part because of you. And she went on to say, it's one of those gifts that, you're so uniquely able to provide as a younger woman. It's an amazing thing to do. So I wonder, Danielle, if you could say more about this motivation to be a surrogate, and a little about the large demographical differences between surrogates and intended parents.
Yeah. So Heather sounds incredible. Yeah. And she seems like she explains the best of surrogacy so well. I think one of the things Canada really has in its favor for someone like Heather is national health care. And yeah. So when parents in America, in the United States, turn to surrogates, they have to have vast resources. Like I say in the book, probably about $100,000 that they can throw at surrogacy. That's beyond what most families or most adults in the United States have at their disposal. So, a person who becomes a surrogate in the United States can often be someone who needs economic support, but who also really wants to help create a family. It might also be someone, I've met a lawyer who is a surrogate. I have a colleague named Grace Cow, who's a professor. She was a surrogate. So there are also people who are professionals, might not need the money and genuinely feel a calling to surrogacy. But I think the danger in the United States, and even more so in a country like India, which has now outlawed commercial surrogacy, is that the surrogate can be exploited because they don't have better options. Right. In a place like Canada, where you have socialized medicine and you just generally have better social support structures, and I think a smaller wealth gap than we have in the United States, I can't help believe that when someone decides to be a surrogate, they are doing so less because they don't have other economic choices than because they really want to. If their medical needs are met, if their financial needs are met, and they still want to be a surrogate, that's very different than if you feel like you have no other choices, but you happen to have a functioning womb. So I think, at its best, surrogacy becomes a gift. It becomes something altruistically that's freely given because you can and you feel called to do so. But it's a lot easier to know that that's your motive when your basic needs are being met by society, when the structure supports you to do that discernment work.
Yeah.
Good. We have a segment on our podcast. It's a rather new segment to get some of our listeners involved here. So Ian's going to kind of tee that up for us a little bit.
Yeah. So this is a brand new segment for our new season. It's called Listener Questions. You can hear the music you can hear the music here. Listener Questions. Isn't that great?
Ian is adding the music right now.
Ian's got it in there.
It's great. And this is today's question, and it's from Matt Martin, who is the Director of Community Engagement at St. Aidan's Church in London, Ontario,
Hey,
and a
that's
former
I know that
guest,
place.
and a former guest of the Vicar's Crossing podcast. Matt, what do you have to say?
Thank you for taking my question. In your book, you talk about self-alienation and the surrogate, and I have a question because my children are both adopted, and prior to us adopting them, my wife and I, we had to go through a series of courses and classes, and in those courses, they drilled it into our heads that it was very important that the child know that they're adopted right from day one. And you mentioned in your book that the surrogate may never know that they are, in fact, a surrogate as they grow up. So for me, I'm wondering why that is, or if you could say more about that. Thank you.
Thanks. That's a great question. So we've known for a long time from research on adoption that children fare best when they are aware of their origins and have access to their origins. And that's in part because it gives them a grounded sense of their identity, but in part because if they don't know and they're not told, they can often find out in very unideal ways. So you imagine in the case of adoption, maybe imagine the child gets cancer and needs a stem cell transplant. That's not a great time to be explaining why you as a parent can't be a stem cell donor for them because you're not going to be a match. So we know this from decades of research in adoption. The same scholars are now finding is true in cases of IVF and surrogacy, that children do best when they know their origins. And I'm sorry, IVF, I mean egg and sperm donation, and surrogacy. So there is, at least in the United States, no kind of way of regulating or enforcing who is told about their origins. I think this is especially likely to occur when an egg or sperm donor is used and the carrier is the intended parent, because they've been pregnant and maybe they choose not to tell the child, and the child looks enough like them that they think maybe they don't have to. But again, we have DNA tests done all the time, and now we have things like 23andMe, and I think most parents probably wouldn't want their child finding out from doing a DNA test that actually they're not their genetic offspring. And there are some news stories where that is how kids find out that, they've got 23 siblings from another sperm donor.
Yes.
You imagine in a case of surrogacy, it would be much harder to cover up or hide that sort of thing. But there are certainly stories that it does happen. And again, in the United States, there's no one forcing you to tell, your child, or any way of regulating that. So especially if a surrogate never meets the intended parent, which certainly can happen in the United States, especially if they're geographically far apart, if it says in their contract that they want to have an anonymous procedure, they don't want to meet each other, they have no contact information for each other, it's certainly possible the child might not know that they were born via a surrogate, and the parents might not tell them.
Wow. Interesting. So one final question just before we wrap up today. We'll talk a little bit about, and make reference to the Sarah and Hagar story in Scripture. Dolores Williams in Sisters in the Wilderness uses the Sarah and Hagar story to argue that surrogacy is essentially harmful. And we mentioned this, and you gave the example of India, because it necessarily results in exploitation of the surrogate by those in positions of power. And Williams argues that there can be nothing redemptive, even positive, in surrogate experiences, because of their essentially exploitive nature. You propose that perhaps Williams' conclusions, and I'm going to quote your work here, cannot be universally applied, and that instead of surrogacy being essentially negative, surrogacy's negativity predicates itself upon the power dynamics that situate it, as well as the value that each member of the surrogacy arrangement places upon the self-construction of the other. The conditions then for healthy surrogacy most appropriately originate from a desire for mutual self-construction rather than exploitation. And this fashions surrogacy at its best into a vocation. And you make the case that biology alone does not define the family, as you say, nothing new to Christianity. However, reclaiming the language of surrogacy in relation to understanding family is. And you write that the surrogate is crucially important to creation itself, the acknowledgement of which elevates the role, provided that the surrogate is not participating because of coercion or self-defeating mechanisms. And you continue that surrogacy, when done well, symbolizes one of the most elegant assurances of Christianity, namely that which vows that God, through relationship, gifts transformation. And what humans do among themselves as co-constructing surrogates thereby imitates the kind of relationship that God has with the human. And I wonder if you could just say more about, reclaiming that importance of surrogacy that removes the emphasis upon sacrifice and places it instead in a conversation with the many instances where God fulfills the promise of hope in response to suffering.
Yeah. So first, I feel that any theologian who's writing about surrogacy owes an enormous debt to Dolores Williams. She was the first person to write about surrogacy, and she had a really important project that she was undertaking, especially because the lives of Black women have been and continue to be to some extent so overlooked in theology and certainly in society. So I think what Dolores Williams is right about is saying that when we construct bodies or human beings in a way that's not respectful of their dignity, that doesn't acknowledge their dignity, then surrogacy is more likely than not going to have a negative value. So she talks about how harmful surrogacy has been at a literal and metaphoric level to Black women, and she's right. The critique that I have is that she is, where it's not a critique, the compliment with an E, not an I, that I have is that I think that this is not the only way surrogacy can exist, because it's not the only way that relationships have to be. It's the way that relationships are because we have socially constructed identity in ways that are harmful to people. But when we recognize that every human being does have dignity, and we create a society where their dignity is upheld, then something like surrogacy can be more freely undertaken, and the desire and calling to be a surrogate may be very real and a great gift that one can give. So going back to the example that you gave of surrogacy in London in Canada, I think that's an example where surrogacy was undertaken under much better conditions, and where a woman made a tremendous choice that she did not see as sacrificial. And I don't think we have a reason to second guess her experience or her wisdom about her desire to be a surrogate. Right. In some ways, this brings the beginning of our time together. It loops it into a circle now that we're towards the end. When I was writing about sexual trauma, I think what I was seeing was that the experience of wanting to remember is something that Miroslav Volf really ignored. I think that the experience of women who genuinely feel called to be surrogates is important to recognize, but it's just as important to recognize that some women are undertaking surrogacy because they're forced to, or because they feel that they have no other options. and that's a very different set of choices, a very different reality. But I would hope that when society is constructed in a way that a person can freely choose, with that kind of support, that they might want to make any one of a number of gifts, and surrogacy might be one of them.
Yeah. Well, hey, this time together with you has been a gift today. I'll tell you that. We've learned a lot. And we really appreciate that.
And I just say, Rob, that I just want to pick up on what you just said, Danielle. I just want to affirm how complementary, again, as you talk about, with an E, your book is around that stuff. Because what I really liked about this book is you actually take great care to examine, interrogate, and discuss that which is difficult in surrogacy, that which is less than dignified, that which tears down, as well as that which builds up. And so I just want to say for the listeners who will pick this book up and read it, that what you're going to get is a very scholarly piece of work, which actually examines so many people who've contributed to this field of study, but really sort of delves into how this can be a co-creating, positive, affirming experience, while acknowledging that we live in a world which is broken. And along with that brokenness comes, like every other thing, abuses of opportunities, technologies, and developments that have come to the fore of our cultures and societies. But I really just want to affirm that your work really complements that of those who offer fair and justified criticism of surrogacy where it needs to be. I just think, as I think about that example of this Heather, that idea of co-creating, of being able to put a family in a fleshy contact with a baby in a moment, and what happens in all of that, there's something bigger at work than just some medical procedure, and that's very sacred in itself. So I learned a whole ton reading this book, and I'm so grateful to you for it.
Yeah, I was so grateful you've given us the time today. So again, folks, Conceiving Family, a practical theology of surrogacy and self. And Danielle's been our guest today, and we're going to make sure we have a link to your book on our website, thevicarscrossing.com, so our listeners can check that out and discover your work and the work of many others that we're so blessed to talk to. So Danielle, thank you so much. We wish you and your family all the best and many blessings in these crazy times. And thank you for joining us today.
Thank you. And to you, it's been my pleasure.
Our guest today, Dr. Danielle Tumminio Hansen, and what a wonderful book, Conceiving Family, a practical theology of surrogacy and self. So thanks to Danielle today. And thank you to our sponsors on the Vicar's Crossing podcast, to A. Miller George Funeral Home, where each life is celebrated, and their sister company, Cremation, London, Middlesex, both family owned and operated, to Hyde Park Care Pharmacy, locally owned, locally operated, locally loved, and to Molly Maid, make your home a healthy haven. Call Molly Maid London today. Guys, thanks very much. Looking forward to seeing you real soon. Episode 3 is coming to your to an internet near you very, very shortly. So we're looking forward to that. In fact, who is that?
We're going to have Brian Allain, who leads a project called How to Heal Our Divides. And this book has little articles from all these great people: Brian McLaren, Dana Butler-Bass, Frank Thomas, Michael Waters, Shane Claiborne, many of whom have been guests on this podcast and are in here. So we'll talk about that one next week.
All right. Now, Rob Henderson from Holy Trinity St. Stephen's.
Kevin George here from St. Aidan's Church.
My name is Ian. Thank you for listening.
And Kevin, remember to always look both ways, young Jedi,
before you cross the street.
Thank you for listening. Our hosts are Kevin George and Rob Henderson. Our producer and composer is myself, Ian, with original artwork done by Elizabeth Dodman. If you have any questions or want to know where to find us, tweet us at Vicar's Crossing or find us on Facebook at The Vicar's Crossing. If you have any other questions about anything heard on this podcast, leave us a comment or look in the description to find out more. Thanks!